Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and this week we're going to be asking the question, did Shakespeare know about unicorns? This is the second lesson in our course on Shakespeare and mythological animals that we are going over through the entire month this month. And the unicorn has fascinated history and literature minds for an absolute millennia. It's this beast, you've seen it, with the single horn pointed and often spiraling out of the center of its forehead. Shakespeare uses the word unicorn in his plays Julius Caesar, The Tempest, Timon of Athens, and he also mentions unicorns in his poem Rape of Lucrece. In Act 4, Scene 3 of Timon of Athens, Shakespeare writes, "Wert thou the unicorn, pride and wrath would confound thee, and make thine own self the conquest of thy fury." That line stems from a history of unicorns and a popular lore that was circulating during Shakespeare's lifetime, where they believed a hunter would capture a unicorn by standing in front of a tree and goading the unicorn into attacking it. And when the unicorn started to run towards the hunter would wait till the very last second and then step out of the way so that the unicorn firmly lodged its horn into the tree instead of into the hunter and couldn't get it back out. So now the unicorn was captured and the hunter could catch it. The medieval bestiaries that we talked about last week tell stories about unicorns, including one story of the Virgin Mary. She's holding a unicorn that falls asleep on her lap. And this image was the foundation for many, many religious artistic interpretations of the story of the unicorn. And some religious writers even interpret the story of the unicorn and its death as a symbol of the passion of the Christ. The religious stories about the unicorn refer to this purity image. That's why the unicorn's often white. But they believed that the unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin, and that was the legend about the animal itself. And some writers used this story as an allegory for Jesus Christ's relationship with the Virgin Mary. When it comes to contextualizing the unicorn into the life of William Shakespeare, the unicorn was actually a prominent feature in the King James Bible that was written in 1611. That's the same year that William Shakespeare performed The Tempest at court before King James himself. When the translators were translating the original Greek and Latin into English for the King James Bible, they took the word rame and they translated it as unicorn. They did that because the unicorn was a recognizable animal. It existed proverbially, and as we just showed, it was a religious symbol symbolizing purity. And the present day Bible translates unicorn into wild ox. The unicorn is mentioned in the Bible in Numbers 23:22 when it says, "God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of the unicorn." In Numbers 24:8, it says, "God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn." Later in Psalms 22:21, it says, "Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Or will he harrow the valley after thee?" It goes on to mention unicorns again in Psalms 92 and Psalm 29. There's also a reference to unicorns in Isaiah 34. Modern readers of the Bible will recognize these verses as including the phrase wild ox in today's American Standard Version of the Bible. That unicorn has been translated to mean wild ox. The classical Jewish understanding of the Bible did not identify Rame as a unicorn, and modern scholars are, as you might expect, rather divided about exactly what you're supposed to think the unicorn animal was. And there's a rich history about why they are divided. Some scholars point to the Tehash animal, which is mentioned in Exodus 25, 26, 35, 36, and 39, as well as Numbers and Ezekiel. The Tehash animal was a single-horned creature, and it existed in Moses' time. It's also similar to an animal called the Koresh animal that was described by Morris Jastro's Talmudic dictionary as, quote, "a type of antelope or unicorn." Remember that the King James Bible was completed in 1611, the same year that William Shakespeare wrote and performed The Tempest. I'll add a note there for Shakespeare scholars that we don't actually know when The Tempest was written, but we do know it was performed at court in November of 1611 before King James. And The Tempest is where one of Shakespeare's references to unicorns appears. Now, can I prove that William Shakespeare read the King James Bible? No. But would he have been a fool not to pay attention to the monumental publication right in the middle of his life? Yes. So, am I calling this one plausible? Absolutely. As you know, though, we can't leave the history of William Shakespeare and unicorns there, though, because there is more to explore. And I mentioned this earlier when I said that the modern Bible uses the phrase wild ox instead of unicorn. Now, here's some history as to why that happened. In European folklore, the unicorn was often depicted as a horse or a goat with this long horn and cloven hooves. I think that sounds a lot like the creatures that show up in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but exploring that is another episode. During the Renaissance, the unicorn was commonly thought of as this wild woodland creature. It was a symbol of purity and grace, and the running theory was that it could only be captured by a virgin. The unicorn's horn was said to have medicinal properties. It was supposed to neutralize a poison, and it was able to heal sickness. In medieval times, Renaissance men would sell unicorn horns, and this was probably actually the horn of a narwhal, which were much more common in the ocean, and they were found or captured and brought back, and the horn of the narwhal was sold as the horn of a unicorn.
Narwhal probe for cracks in the ice, eagerly heading for open waters. Social animals, they travel in close, tight groups. The narwhal are the unicorns of the seas. Their horns were highly prized by humans and were thought to have magical powers. The horn, which is usually found on males, is really a spiral tooth, 9 feet long.
Now, why does this apply to Shakespeare and King James? Well, the actual throne of Denmark, the throne chair of Denmark, is said to be made of unicorn horns. It is almost certainly actually made of narwhal tusks, but this same material was used for ceremonial cups because the unicorn's horn had all these medicinal properties that people wanted. It was a big fear for monarchs during the time period that they would be poisoned. Queen Elizabeth had this fear. King James was wildly superstitious. So kings and queens were constantly afraid of being poisoned, and the idea of having a cup that you could use that would neutralize the poison was very, very attractive. In the play Hamlet, which is set in Denmark, where the protagonists and the key players all suffer and die from poison, including the king who sits on the throne of Denmark. I think there's a relationship there, but you can explore that further. There was the powder that was made from the narwhal horns or from unicorn horns was alicorn powder. It was sold in Europe for medicinal purposes all the way up into the 18th century. So this was not a passing fad. This was not something that was lightly in the culture there for William Shakespeare. It was a big, big deal. Alicorn was thought to cure many diseases. This reputation for preventing harm was one reason it played into Scotland using it in its heraldic symbols. The unicorn is famous in Scotland. Remember, King James of England was from Scotland, and the unicorn is known as being the natural enemy of the lion, and the lion was the heraldic symbol for England. When England and Scotland officially unified in 1707, the unicorn and the lion were placed on the national country emblem that is still used today. Queen Elizabeth II has 2 different emblems for England and Scotland, one of which places the unicorn prominently for Scotland, and the other one that places the England lion more prominently, that is used in England. For Scotland, the unicorn embodied their national spirit. It was this animal that would rather die than be conquered, and for Scotland, they strongly identified with that. And there is a famous series of tapestries called The Hunt of the Unicorn that was completed in the 16th century, and this shows a nobleman pursuing a unicorn. And the nobleman, along with these huntsmen, bring the animal to bay with the help of a virgin who traps it under her charms. They appear to kill it, and then they bring it back to the castle. And the last and most famous panel shows the unicorn in captivity. There's some ambiguity there because how could they have killed it? And then the last panel having it being trapped. So Anyway, it's a picture book of sorts. It's a series of tapestries that tell a story. So there aren't words to tell you exactly what's going on. So you kind of have to guess. So there's a little bit of disconnection in the story overall. But this idea, this theme of their hunting a unicorn and using a virgin to help you catch it, was a popular story for the Renaissance. And during Shakespeare's lifetime, there were many, many artists creating paintings and tapestries and drawings that featured unicorns and versions of this tale. One very famous recreation shows up in Scotland, and a record, a 16th century inventory for Scone Castle, shows that there was a series of tapestries featuring a unicorn placed on permanent display there during the 16th century. Remember that Scone Castle is where Malcolm is crowned king at the end of Shakespeare's Macbeth. According to Scone Castle's website, it was only the very wealthy people who could afford tapestries, and James V, that would be James I of England and Shakespeare's official patron, had a large collection of these tapestries, including 2 sets which showed unicorns, and that suggests that James I liked unicorns. I have to think William Shakespeare would have paid attention to this. A set of tapestries based on the hunt of the unicorn hangs at Scone Castle today. The original 16th century tapestries are actually in New York City at the Met. There was also currency in Scotland during the 15th and 16th century that was actually called a unicorn. There was a gold coin called the unicorn, and there was another coin called a half unicorn, and these were used as forms of payment in Scotland. I would have to think some of them came to England in the pockets of the Scottish when they arrived as part of King James's court. Possibly even with James I himself, I don't know. Scotland loved the unicorn. It was used not only as a popular symbol for decoration, but it was a symbol of authority. They're called market crosses. Now that's the Scots word for market crosses, which basically, whenever a town was given the authority to hold a market there, they had to be given that authority by the monarch. And so a special cross would be set up to say, we have permission to do this. On those market crosses was a unicorn showing the authority given them by the monarch to hold such a market. Following this rule as authority, sometimes noblemen were even granted special permission to use the unicorn on their heraldic symbol of their coat of arms. And one example of this is the Clan Cunningham from Scotland, which has a unicorn's head featuring on their coat of arms. It's entirely possible that Shakespeare mentioned unicorns in The Tempest, specifically because he was going to be performing it before King James of Scotland, who was also the King of England at the time. Now, as far as legends goes and legendary creatures, mythology was a source for William Shakespeare, but interestingly, unicorns are not mentioned in Greek mythology. The first place that we have mention of unicorns is actually in an account of natural history. Now, last week we discussed how bestiaries and records of natural history and existing animals in the world kind of blends in that there wasn't a requirement that your natural history record include only real animals. So there are references to mythological creatures in the bestiaries, but it is notable that unicorns don't show up in records of mythology, but instead only in records of this natural history. It's plausible to think that for the Renaissance mind and people like Shakespeare and his contemporaries, this line between what was real and what was imaginary was blurred. Far off places contained all manner of exotic creatures. If you think about seeing an elephant or a rhinoceros for the very first time, these are animals that would be hard to think up in your natural imagination. And once you see them, it seems impossible that they would exist until yet there they are. So it's plausible to think to the Renaissance mind that a unicorn would have existed with all of its mythical, mystical, fantastical glory. They could have believed that something like that was real. In fact, there are some animals we think that history might be referring to when they call it a unicorn. The earliest description of the unicorn is from the book Indica, which translates on India. So it's a book about India and the things that were there. It describes a creature known as a wild ass, and it resembled something that lives in India called an auroch, which has these massive horns. To me, it looks like a mix between a cow and a rhinoceros because it's massive and it has 2 horns coming out of its head that's just really huge. And so a lot of writers and travelers and explorers thought that the unicorn came from India. Exploration lent itself towards this belief because in India and the Indus Valley, there are drawings that appear to depict unicorns. The author of On India learned of his information while living in Persia. Aristotle drew from this writer and these books when he was writing about a one-horned animal. We know that Aristotle influenced Shakespeare, so if the account of India influenced Aristotle, then this tale could have bled its way into Shakespeare's works that way. The auroch from India is one animal that the biblical translation from unicorn to wild ox might have been based upon. In the last century, that's been the conclusion reached by Hebrew scholars. The use of the unicorn word in the King James Bible of 1611, as well as the modernization of unicorn to be wild ox today, both make sense with if you look at the reference to Pliny the Elder. We know Pliny the Elder's writings was something Shakespeare had read and was using when writing his plays. And he mentions the oryx and an Indian ox. He says that they are both one-horned beasts, as well as, quote, a very fierce animal called the monoceros, which was the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, and the tail of a boar. While the rest of the body is like that of a horse. It makes a deep, lowing noise and has a single black horn which projects from the middle of its forehead. To me, that sounds like a rhinoceros. And interestingly, while many black and white rhinos do live in Africa, which would make you think, wait, how could people writing about India be writing about a rhinoceros? We have to remember the greater one-horned rhinoceros are found in the swamps and forests of northern India and southern Nepal. Pliny the Elder was not the only guy who thought that the rhinoceros was what people were writing about when they wrote about the unicorn. Marco Polo also describes unicorns as rhinoceroses. He says, quote, scarcely smaller than elephants, they have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant's. They have a single large black horn in the middle of the forehead, and they have a head like a wild boar's. They spend their time by preference wallowing in mud and slime. They are very ugly brutes to look at. They are not at all such as we describe them when we relate that they themselves be captured by virgins, but clean contrary to our notions. So obviously, when the word unicorn got used and was describing real life animals, which is probably one reason they show up in the bestiaries, there's some overlap. This writer was talking about an auroch, and this writer was talking about a rhinoceros, and they're calling both of them a unicorn. You kind of have to look a little deeper into what they were talking about, which is how unicorns came to be known as real creatures that lived a long time ago, because a long time ago they called real creatures unicorns. Leonardo da Vinci wrote about unicorns. He said, quote, the unicorn, though its intemperance and not knowing how to control itself, for the love it bears to fair maidens, forgets its ferocity and wildness, and laying aside all fear, it will go up to a seated damsel and go to sleep in her lap, and thus the hunters take it. So obviously Leonardo da Vinci held to the classical view of unicorns. However you slice it, William Shakespeare did in fact know about unicorns, and they were real creatures for people living in Shakespeare's lifetime. Now, whether they were talking about a rhinoceros, an auroch, or some horse with a horn, or the narwhal is up to the different writer, and which one Shakespeare had in mind depends on the story he was telling. And we may never actually know which version of a unicorn Shakespeare thought about, but they were real animals for William Shakespeare's time period. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Casty Cash, that Shakespeare girl. Don't forget to check out the show notes for today's episode at castycash.com/unicorns. If you would like to go further into this topic, that's a great place to start. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Do you want to get high school academic credit for studying Shakespeare and unicorns, Shakespeare and rhinoceroses, as well as Elizabethan card games, learning how to write with a quill pen, and many other aspects of the life of William Shakespeare? Well, now you can inside that Shakespeare Life membership community. It's designed to go beyond the episodes we do here on YouTube and beyond the episodes we share with you every Monday on the podcast to let you really get your hands around the history of William Shakespeare. We don't study Shakespeare the way that you might be used to because I don't consider Shakespeare's plays to be works of literature. Instead, the plays are plays. They're performance pieces. They were not only meant to be spoken aloud, but they have to be taken in context of both what was happening on stage and the audience to whom they were meant to be performed. Shakespeare took both of these things into account when choosing his words and stories, so it seems only fair that as students of his plays, we take those things into account as well. But because I think learning should be fun, all of the courses that are in there take a real life look at William Shakespeare's history, and we teach you about things like unicorns and where they show up in the plays. I also include links to where you can watch these plays performed. There are a lot of playing companies that show their plays and upload it to YouTube so you can see an actual performance without having to pay for a ticket. And I link to those inside the membership area as well. When you complete 8 of the dozens of courses that are available inside the membership area, you complete 2 academic credits, one for history and one for British literature, because we are linking you back to the plays and showing you where to study them. You are getting 2 academic credits for high school just for studying Shakespeare along with me. It's amazing. If you're interested in doing that, you can find out more at castycash.com/member. If you would like a copy of the syllabus I've put together, that's a 35-week outline of what lessons you can take and when to make sure that you do enough to get these academic credits. That syllabus is free. You can download it from the castycash.com/member. Wait, wrong website. You can find the 35-week syllabus in the show notes for today's episode, which is castycash.com/unicorns. That's castycash.com/unicorns. Download the syllabus right from there. If there's any confusion, just send me an email and I'll send you the syllabus. You sign up for the newsletter on that page and you'll get the download for free, so you can take a look at the syllabus and see if that might be right for you. And if you need help knowing where to assign things like papers, notes for where to include that are in there as well. I wanted to make sure you knew that was there. Consider becoming a member. Thanks for watching this lesson with me this week, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.